All right, I think we can go ahead and start. So I want to start off by thanking you all for coming to spend your evening learning about ocean acidification tonight. My name is Darcy Dugan, and I'm the director of the Alaska Ocean Acidification Network. And the network was started in 2016 with the mission of advancing our understanding of ocean acidification, both the processes and the consequences, and also to start thinking about mitigation and adaptation actions. Can you all hear me? Great. And so tonight is part of a statewide effort to help educate and engage Alaskans. Ocean acidification and ocean warming both have been increasingly in the news and at the attention of scientists and also the fishing industry on a state and national and international level. And 2 years ago, the United Fishermen of Alaska conducted a survey of their membership, and they asked an open-ended question of what topic were they most interested or concerned about and wanted more information on. And the number one thing there was ocean warming and ocean acidification. So a priority among many. One of the first things that we learned when we started monitoring for ocean acidification in Alaska in 2011, or I guess we confirmed when we started to monitor, was that waters around our coast are particularly susceptible due to natural factors, and Bob will be getting into that more later in a few minutes. But that means we as Alaskans need to be astute and we need to be prepared. And one way to think about it is studying ocean acidification is kind of like putting headlights on a car. It helps us know what's coming, and if we can't stop the car, we can at least see what's ahead of us and find out as much as we can and prepare and adapt and work together. And a key thing, I think, as we approach this topic too, is also not be debilitated by hopelessness. Should we be concerned? Yes. Are there things we can do to address this? Yes. And so tonight we're going to have a chance to hear from some experts here to provide the latest information on what we know about what's going on in our waters and also some of the efforts underway to help us move forward. Our speakers this evening are going to be Bob Foy. He's the director of NOAA's Alaska Fisheries Science Center, and he's going to be talking about what is ocean acidification and how it works, what we're doing around Alaska's waters to monitor and what we're finding through that research, and also what we know so far about species response. And then Toby Schwer from the University of Alaska and Molly Mayo from the Meridian Institute are going to be talking about a new and exciting project on salmon, looking at how salmon respond and the influences of tipping points. And a key piece of that work is working with the fishing community to begin developing adaptation strategies and ideas for our salmon managers. And today is the first day that project is presented. We talked earlier to the Board of Fisheries. We're appreciating their ability to use their space this evening. And then we'll wrap up with a few more resources that are available through the Alaska Ocean Acidification Network, and then we want to open it up to a Q&A. So we're hoping to keep our presentation relatively on the short side so that we can have kind of a community dialogue to help answer questions and hear what you're interested in learning. Tonight's speakers and many others are part of this network, we call it the OA network. And the membership is pretty broad. It's got agency and government scientists, research and academic institutions that are actively monitoring. The network is also made up of fishermen and shellfish growers and educators and tribes and hatchery owners. And our goal is to try to work together so that we can maximize our research efforts and share data and identify information needs and priorities, and most importantly, engage with users of that information to make sure that we are answering the right questions, so that we're trying to answer the questions that are most important to Alaskans. So we're looking forward to a good discussion tonight. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Bob Foy, Director of NOAA's Alaska Fisheries Science Center. And he's formerly the head of NOAA's Kodiak Lab and a leading expert on species response, especially with respect to crab. And we have kind of a funny microphone here that involves, I think, sitting, or maybe you can wander around with the mic a little bit. We'll just kind of ad-lib from here. But here's Bob.
Thank you, Darcy. If I talk this loud, do I need a microphone? No. Okay, no one said they couldn't hear me.
Maybe turn it off, Bob.
You understood the irony of that, right? Just off. Okay. That better? Great. I like to walk around a bit. So, as Darcy said, our goal is to talk about ocean acidification this evening. So, I'm going to walk us through a series of slides that talk about first, what is ocean acidification? Who thinks they know what ocean acidification is? Ooh. Raise them high, don't feel ashamed. Okay, so we've got some folks that know what ocean acidification is. Who has not heard of ocean acidification? Okay, so everyone's at least heard of it. Good. Alaskans tend to be the most educated on some of these climate and acidification talks. Number one, because we give a lot of these talks, but number two, because it's happening in our backyard, which is really important. So, ocean acidification is caused by carbon dioxide that's in the ocean. The reason the amount of carbon dioxide going in the ocean is increasing is because the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere is going up. And how do we know that? We know that because we've been measuring it for a long time. So the location with the best data set is in Hawaii, at the top of Mauna Loa. There is a site where they have been collecting data on the air and how much carbon dioxide is in that air. So what we have found, this slide shows from 2013 to 2018, and this is how much carbon dioxide is in the air on the y-axis there. And what you can see is that one of the lines is variable. So what this is summer and winter. The Earth breathes. The plants take up carbon dioxide in the summer, and they respire in the winter. So the atmosphere actually has levels of carbon dioxide that go up and down every single year. That's what we're measuring in the top of the Mauna Loa. The line through the middle is the average. The point is, the line through the middle is increasing. So the overall amount of carbon dioxide that's in the air is going up. Even though it goes up and it comes down every year, on average, it's going up. So you might ask yourself, okay, this is probably some natural process. How much farther back do we think this is going? So this slide shows the same data set from when it started in the late 1950s. You can see the little squiggles there. That's the seasonal trend and the overall line going up. So what this shows is that the line is increasing at a faster rate. So the amount of carbon dioxide in the air is going up faster than it was even in the 1950s and 1960s. So that's important because anything that has to deal with that carbon dioxide now has to deal with it increasing faster. So now you ask yourself, and a lot of skeptics say, okay, this has been going on for a long time. The numbers are going up. We'll be fine. I don't seem to notice the difference between the 1970s till now. But what about looking back further? So this slide shows back a little bit further, 800,000 years further. So what we've done, and I apologize for standing in front of folks, so I'll try to quit moving around here. What we've done is we've looked in ice cores. We've gone through ice cores that represent what the atmosphere looked like 800,000 years ago. And we've measured how much carbon dioxide is trapped in that ice. And then we've plotted it. And what you can see is that the Earth goes through these periods of high carbon dioxide and low carbon dioxide. In the periods where there's high carbon dioxide, the world's oceans did not have shell-forming animals in them, because we can compare this to what's in the archaeological and what we have in those cores, the types of material that's in there. The biggest concern right now, if you can see it, is on the far right-hand side is where we are right now. This really steep line. We are up over 400. So what you can see is that the planet did this for hundreds of thousands of years, and then we came around and it shot straight up. That's the problem. That's our concern. It's not that the planet hasn't gone through these processes before. It's not that we haven't had volcanic issues and other problems on the planet that increase the carbon dioxide. But right now it's happened at such an incredible rate since the Industrial Revolution that what we're worried about is how fast the animals can adapt to it. So now your next question is, okay, that's happening in the air. What does this have to do with the ocean? So 1/3 of all that carbon dioxide that goes in the air ends up in the ocean, 30%. So early on, scientists said, great, 30% of it goes into the ocean, we don't have to worry about it. And how much trouble can it get into in the ocean? Well, it turns out that 1/3 of CO2 is also increasing the acidity. So folks who are thinking, okay, again, this is a natural process. How do we know that this is human caused? How do we know that the carbon dioxide we're putting in the atmosphere matters? What this slide shows is the amount of carbon dioxide that's emitted into the air from different industries. The gray area is fossil fuels, and the greenish kind of brown area there is forestry and taking down rainforests. But what you can see is that similar trajectory since the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, where it starts increasing substantially. So we know, because we've measured this, how much of this carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere is man-made. Now you compare this to the previous slide, and you start to see a similar trend. So then the question is, now let's take this to the ocean. So this shows that same data set, that solid line is the data from the top of Mauna Loa. The data in green is the local waters around Hawaii, the green and the blue lines. So the green line is the amount of carbon dioxide, and the blue line is the pH. They're related. So basically, the carbon dioxide has gone up in the water. The pH has gone down. At the same time, this atmospheric CO2 has gone up. So, and this is one data set. There's many data sets that show this.
Are they monitoring the carbon dioxide in other areas besides Mauna Loa?
They are. The reason Mauna Loa is so wonderful is because the air is so clean and perfect, that high up where we have instruments. There are similar instruments around the world that show similar trends. This particular trend is called the Keeling curve because of the originator of the data in the 1950s, goes back the furthest because he had the foresight to start collecting it and no one really had at that point. So what this shows is ocean acidification that we are currently seeing in the waters around Alaska. So this is the Bering Sea. This is depth in the water. So 0 at the top, 80 meters at the bottom. So this shows, and this is a transect across the Bering Sea. So what it shows is that any area where you have light colors, you have a low amount of carbon dioxide being dissolved. In areas that are dark colors, you have a large amount of carbon dioxide that's being dissolved. What that means is that carbon dioxide is higher in those areas. Now this is happening down at the bottom of the ocean. The reason this is happening at the bottom of the ocean in the Bering Sea is not because man-made CO2 is getting all the way to the bottom of the ocean. This is because the warming trends are melting the ice. There's production, there's plants, there's algae being formed, but there's nothing to eat it. The ecosystem is completely new, so it all falls to the bottom. Bacteria eat it and give off carbon dioxide. So we're starting to see issues on the bottom of the Bering Sea and north as we get less and less ice. Now eventually the ecosystem will catch up and you'll have fish in the mid part of the water column and you'll start eating those plants. But right now we're seeing the initial impacts of that change. So what are we doing about it? This is a study that was done to assess the initial risk in commercial fisheries, in the fishing sector. So what this study did was look at the vulnerability and the human exposure of different coastal communities to the potential effects of acidification. And I know this is difficult to read, so I'll explain it. The areas in red represent the regions of Alaska that are the most exposed to acidification. And that's because They are dependent on species that we think are going to be negatively affected in the long run by ocean acidification, and they don't have a lot of diversity in their economies. The other regions either are less dependent on some of those marine species or have more diversity in their economies so they can look towards other species if ocean acidification becomes a problem. One thing I'll note is that what this group was not able to do was look at the ecosystem effects. So for instance, on the North Slope, whale populations, which those communities depend on, also those whales depend on the food base, amphipods, krill, copepods. That's not part of this study. It is not clear how that's going to be affected by acidification. So this is just focused on fisheries. So with this kind of information that suggests there is a high risk and there's an economic risk, we have started collecting and monitoring the best we can in different parts of the ocean around Alaska. So we have some studies where we've looked at the changes in glacial runoff, because the amount of fresh water in our oceans changes the pH of those oceans. So we've started to look at that and conducted studies. The dotted lines in blue represent different areas where we've sampled the whole water column. The areas throughout Alaska's waters, we're using new technologies to go out and collect chemistry in the water. We have drones in the ocean right now that are collecting information on temperature and pH that are all throughout the Bering Sea, remote control. We've got a number of drones that go under the water and collect the same information. We've got shipboard studies. We've got moorings that we're putting out. Notice how few moorings we have, and think about how large Alaska is compared to the rest of the United States. We have very few monitoring sites in Alaska. We've got some laboratory work being done. In Southeast Alaska, Ketchikan, Hakai, Seward, and Kodiak, we have instruments that are measuring the amount of carbon dioxide and the pH of the water every 30 seconds. And we're noting daily trends, seasonal trends, and annual trends at these locations. We're just starting to understand what that means. There's a number of other studies. There's one on the marine highway system. We've got a system on the ferry in Southeast Alaska that's collecting data as that vessel transits different waters and gives us a different snapshot of areas and the ocean chemistry at the surface of the water. So what are we learning? What does all this monitoring do for us? What we've learned right off the bat is that conditions are not uniform. The amount of carbon dioxide that's in the water, the pH, the temperature, as you know, is highly variable throughout Alaska's waters. Fall and winter tend to be more corrosive. Colder water holds more carbon dioxide, so it tends to be more corrosive in that process. Cold years are worse. Again, carbon dioxide in the water. Glacial melt, freshwater outflow, and upwelling are exacerbating factors. That means fresh water is bad for alkalinity. It changes the chemistry of the ocean. So, fast forward to what's been happening with the heat waves in the last couple of years. The amount of freshwater flow in the Gulf of Alaska this summer was greater coming out of glaciers than it was coming from rain. That's astounding. That's warming. That's a separate warming trend that's putting this high alkaline water into the oceans. That's another talk. Future projections. So where do we think this is all going? This shows Southeast Alaska. These are the different months from January to December. These are years from 2020 on the bottom up to 2100 in the top. So this is an estimate of where we think it's going. What we've done is we've looked at models of where we think the world's climate's going, international climate centers, and we've modeled how much carbon dioxide we think is going to be in the waters in Alaska. So in southeast Alaska, what this shows you is when you hit that white line is the point when you hit the line where calcium carbonate dissolves. So if you take a piece of chalk, calcium carbonate, or a crab shell, calcium carbonate, and you put it in the ocean, at the surface right now, it's not going to dissolve right away. But if you put it in corrosive waters, high CO2 waters, it's going to dissolve. So right now what that's saying is our surface waters are likely to hit that in the February through May months between 2040 and 2080. That's a problem. Right now the bottom waters are naturally corrosive. So a lot of animals like golden king crab already live in this kind of water. So our concern is not about some of the animals that are closer to the bottom that are already in this water. Our concern is about the animals who have never experienced this kind of water. You may have heard on the West Coast, they had issues with upwelling. That was affecting bivalve hatcheries. And they completely had to shift how they do their operations in hatcheries. That upwelled water is deep ocean water that's corrosive. So that is an example of what's likely to happen with ocean acidification. So the next slide, this shows Resurrection Bay and Kodiak. And this is because we've got moorings in these places that tell us what the seasonal variability is. What this shows you is that for Kodiak, not as great a concern. We're not going to achieve some of these thresholds until 2060 or later. Still a concern. The reason for this is because of the amount of production that we have in Kodiak waters. There's more production off of Port Block Bank than anywhere in the Gulf of Alaska. So that takes up, all those plants suck up all the carbon dioxide. So that's part of that story. Some of it is just the local chemistry that's different in these different areas, water chemistry. So this just shows all three together and the expectations by year of when you would have a percentage of your year where shell-building animals would have a problem. Point being, it's not 100 years or 200 years out into the future. It's around the corner. So what are we doing about this? The next step in our research is to assess what the effects are on animals. So what could those effects be? Carbon dioxide goes in and there's direct effects. We have found direct effects of carbon dioxide on crab. It directly affects them. You put crab in water that has higher CO2, it's most often a negative situation. There's also indirect effects. So if the food I eat is negatively affected by high temperatures or ocean acidification, I'm not going to do well. So most of the food in the ocean has some sort of shell. If those shells aren't forming and those animals aren't growing, that becomes a problem. Sensory effects. There's been a lot of studies done that have shown that the change in acidification affects the fish's ability to smell. They have found this with salmon. They have found this with some fishing off of Australia. If they can't smell, they don't find food. If they don't find food, they starve. Cumulative effects. It's warming temperatures on top of this. And I'll hit upon this again in a later slide. So what we did at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center is we're responsible for managing fish and crab stocks. Crab stocks in particular, we knew ocean acidification was out there, and we felt that it was necessary that we start assessing the effects of acidification. So we focused on commercially important fish and shellfish species, particularly ones that have calcareous shells. We focused on their prey and on shelter. So we looked at coral as well, because coral is critical. Some species of Trimnoa coral are critical for rockfish and other species. We wanted to look at pH monitoring over time. We wanted to understand the physiological response of the animals to these changes. And then we wanted to forecast what the effects would be. No sense in keep on doing the research if we don't think that these effects are a big deal. And then in more recent years, we've been thinking about adaptation. So for a number of years, we found out what the negative effects or no effects are. In some cases, there's no effects. And then we're starting to ask the question, well, could animals adapt? What about the animals that survive our experiments? Is that them adapting? does it mean that some animals are going to survive this, and we have to make sure we protect those some that could survive so that the population has resilience moving forward. So, I've got to do a little chemistry. How does ocean acidification affect crabs? I talked about this a little bit. Carbon dioxide mixes with water. It also sucks up carbonate ion in order to make bicarbonate. So if you take seawater and blow bubbles in it, carbon dioxide, you will suck up all the carbonate that's in that water and make bicarbonate. So the problem with that is shellfish and coral need that carbonate to build their shells. If it's gone, they can't build their shells. That's what's happening. The other aspect of this, so that's calcium, that's carbonate, calcium carbonate. The other aspect, it's a two-pronged issue with acidification. So you've got a lack of carbonate, but then you also have lower pH. A fish might not really care about carbonate. A pollock doesn't necessarily care what the carbonate numbers are. Crab cares. But a pollock, the lower pH might affect the ability to get gases across its gills. We know that changes in pH, just like you go to the doctor and the doctor checks the pH of your blood, it changes the ability for you to function physiologically. It's the same thing in an animal in the ocean. You lower the pH, you're going to change the ability of that fish to get oxygen across the gills. So many studies around the world. There are thousands of studies on ocean acidification now. When we first started talking about this 12, 15 years ago, it was in the tens to hundreds. Changes in respiration rates, changes in metabolism. This is just a stressor. If I turn the heat way up in this room, you're all going to get stressed out. If we turn the heat up in the ocean, animals get stressed out. We change the pH, they've got to regulate it somehow, they get stressed out. They become ill quicker. They have a harder time reproducing or feeding. So it's stress. So we conducted a number of research projects focused on the individual to see what the tolerance of individual organisms is, and then we scaled that up to populations. So I'm just going to show, actually I'm going to walk through what our research was. So we've looked at all the different crab species, and this is being led by Chris Long right now at the Kodiak Laboratory. We looked at oocyte, embryo, larval, juveniles. We looked at all the lower life stages, and we looked to see whether they survive. We looked to see if they changed their growth. We looked at their genetics to see if there was any kind of change when they're exposed to ocean acidification. We looked at their blood to see whether or not it changed the dynamics and their ability to send calcium to build their own shells, and it does affect that. We looked at mechanics. So we looked at tanner crab claws. And what we found, we know that the claws are used to feed. What we found is that the claw is the first place to become more brittle. It's structurally impacted by the lower pH. So the calcium carbonate issue is first and foremost affected in the claw. Maybe it's a problem. If it gets to a certain point, it's not necessarily going to be able to break that bivalve and feed. So that's the next stage of studies that we're looking at right now. So what we did is a bunch of biologists became chemists. We set up ocean acidification laboratories where early on we were in mad chemist phase, and we just put acid in the water and had low pH water, and it was a bit of a mess. You can imagine, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know it, but acid in the water, it's bad for things. But we've gotten much more sophisticated. Now we can mimic what we expect the world's oceans, Alaska's oceans in particular, to look like in the next 20, 30, 50, 100 years from now. And we mimic that. We bubble CO2 in the water. We monitor it at extreme levels, very sensitive, and we conduct these high-value experiments. So one of the experiments we did was with tanner crab. It's not simple enough to just put an animal in a beaker and watch it grow and see what happens. You need to look and see throughout the life stage of the animal. So we conducted a 3-year study, one of the longest ones conducted anywhere on the planet looking at ocean acidification. We took adult females, we raised their larvae, and we looked at what the effect was. And then we did it again in year 2, and then we mated those same females and we did it again in year 3. So what that meant is that female went from being wild to being mated in the laboratory to having her oocytes develop in acidified conditions in the laboratory. So we were able to track that whole process and determine when and if ocean acidification affects these animals. So we start with an embryo. So kind of a pencil, that's a millimeter across there, a couple millimeters. You can see a yolk, there's an eye, an embryo, and poor students measured thousands and thousands and thousands of them in different treatments. And our goal was to see how that development changes over time. What we found was that at the lowest pH, and this is a pH we expect to see in Alaska's waters in the next 80 to 100 years, so not too far off. You might say that's extreme. Years comes fast. So we wanted to test that. 10% larger yolks, 6% smaller embryos. So you think, larger yolk, more food. What the animal is doing is adapting. It's growing smaller, saving energy. So what does that mean, though? It means the larvae are smaller. Does it mean they're food? Does it mean they don't survive because they're much smaller? Does it mean that they never reach commercial size? There's a lot of potential effects that this could have in the long game. The growth of an invertebrate like this in the ocean is set early on in its life. We looked at larvae. So we looked at those larvae for 2 different years. So the first column here is year 1, and the first circle is ambient. So that's pH of about 8. That's what the ocean is right now, 8.1. 7.8, 7.5. Next 30 to 50 years, next 50, 80, 100 years. And we looked to see what their success was. So the light color means all's good. The larva hatched, everybody survived, everything's good. The dark color means they didn't survive or they didn't hatch at all. So in year 1, everything looked great. That's the female that came from the wild. So just the larva being exposed, no big deal, they all survived. But when the mom was exposed while developing the embryos, almost 50% failure in all their offspring, right off the bat in the 7.5. So what this suggests is that there's this longer term carryover effect in being exposed to these conditions. The larvae were 10% smaller, but silver lining here, the animals that survived the experiments continue to live past the 3rd year and past the 4th year. So what that suggests is that a portion of the genetics, a portion of the animals that survived did well in this situation. It suggests that some of these animals might adapt if those animals are alive to adapt. If we've adequately managed in a way that allows us to make sure that the genetic diversity is high enough to deal with this environmental concern. Juveniles. So the lines show mortality. So these are juveniles, mad scientist stuff again. We stick them in tanks. We see when they die over time. The dashed line is the lowest pH. The solid line is our control. And what this shows, and we didn't feed them. Yes, I was permitted. And what it shows, as you expect after about 100 days, the animals start dying. You're not feeding them. But what it shows is that when they're acidified, they're under higher stress. They die at a much faster rate. Again, that shows a physiological stress to the animal. This shows their growth. Growth changed over time. We had variable results, but the growth was lower in the highest pH. They did not grow as much. Crabs grow by molting. So the problem with molting is it's also stressful, and crab die during the molt a lot. So actually a point I was going to make here. So what we were seeing, and I'm not going to show all these results because I'd be up here for hours, is that these animals that were growing also had a high, that were growing slower, also had a high calcification level. amount of calcium in their shells was still high. So what it appears is that there's a trade-off. They're saying, okay, I need to maintain the amount of calcium in my shell for protection, but I can't grow because of it. I put all my energy into my shell. So this is another example where the animals are likely going to be smaller. So is there evidence for acclimation or adaptation? I showed that the effects at these different stages are very significant. I showed that the larval stage effects are minimal. When we just put larvae in acidification, they decrease their metabolism and they just don't grow. So there's an adaptation there. This trade-off I just mentioned between calcification. Adult crab do everything they can to make sure the pH in their blood is consistent. We even went crazy and stuck them in very, very high CO2 water to see if they would eventually shift their blood to a more acidic blood, and they don't. They have all of the necessary tools, physiological tools, to keep their blood at a constant pH. That's a lot of energy. So they're putting their energy into that. It means they might survive, but it means they might be smaller. So what are we doing with all this information? So what, Bob? You grew a bunch of crab in the laboratory, a bunch of them died. What does that mean in the real world? How does that play out to what we may see in the ecosystem or economically? How does that matter to communities? So we've taken this laboratory data, these data, we have combined them with population dynamics models. So these are the same models that are used to manage the stocks. So this is how we predict how many crab are going to be there next year so that we can set quotas. We then take that and we run it out into bioeconomic models that have all sorts of international data that feed into what's going to happen if the tanner crab stock declines as a result of these changes in ocean acidification. And what we come up with is, as you would expect, a greater than 50% decrease in the catch and profits within 20 years. That's not within 20 years now, that's within 20 years of the ocean pH hitting that 7.8, where we think it's going to matter. If you're following tanner crab stocks right now, you know they're already hurting both in the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea. Add this on top of it. What does that equate to? Just the acidification alone equates to about $1 billion in welfare loss to Alaskan household communities over the stretch of time, meaning this resource is gone for them. So we're trying to put this in perspective. Just briefly, other species, red king crab, much more sensitive than tanner crab. In acidified waters, if you look at them, they die. Golden king crab, very resilient. They already live at depth. Snow crab, the big one. Snow crab, we are finding no effect of ocean acidification in our laboratory studies, and we're on round 3. So that bodes well. What it means is that they've got some genetic predisposition to be able to deal with these more acidic waters. That's a good thing, given the importance of that stock in the Bering Sea. The concern is for some of these other stocks and what it means for dynamics. Northern rock sole, more sensitive. So northern rock sole larvae, we're seeing negative impact. Pollock, no impact at all. Pollock and cod in the early life stages due to changes in pH based on acidification, what we'd expect. Our concern now is we're conducting a number of studies looking at that behavior and to see whether or not they're able to feed adequately in an acidified environment, because a lot of other studies are finding that fish are not able to do that. So that's what we're working on right now. So, is this happening in a vacuum? Lots of other things going on out there. Who's heard of the blob? Read the newspaper. It's all over the front page of the newspaper. Heat waves, blobs, sea ice going down. All of this is happening in this great big context of climate change and environmental variability. So we're measuring the effects of that on commercial fisheries. Half the cod stock in the Bering Sea swam 1,000 miles north in 2 years. because of the warming trends and the lack of sea ice. That's not minor. That's huge. That's on a planetary scale, huge. We don't know what's going to happen to this cod. Are they going to stay there and thrive? Are they going to die? Or are they going to come back? One of those alternatives is not very good. We're looking at subsistence fisheries. Whole communities are without their subsistence fisheries when the ice goes away and there are no ice seeds. This is a major issue for Northwest Alaska. Protected resources, ecosystems. How do we manage in this context? We manage back to concepts of stability. We are not in a stable environment, and if anything, we're in an extreme environment. This shows the sea ice extent in the Bering Sea. The bottom two lines represent, this is season and how much ice there is. The bottom two lines show the last 2 years. It's never been lower. There's so much heat in the Arctic right now, we're concerned. A blob. And it's all over the newspapers. This is a big deal, the amount of heat that's in our system. So ocean acidification is not going to happen out there by itself. So if things are stressed out now, they're going to be even more stressed out with acidification. So my take home, ocean acidification is affecting Alaska right now. Southeast, southwest, likely to be impacted quickly. Ocean acidification is going to get worse. But my real take home, can we adapt? Can the animals adapt? Potentially. We have an opportunity to manage these ecosystems as ecosystems and manage in a way that considers acidification, considers the changes in temperature that we're seeing out there, and consider how we make sure that there's enough to withstand and be resilient to these longer term changes. And yet not stop all fishing. We can do both. We can manage at the same time. Diversifying economies. We need to pay attention to our communities. Are we talking to the communities that are dependent on our fishing resources about these changes that we're seeing? Are we interacting with them directly and regularly to understand what these effects are? Increasing alternative sources of protein and reducing other environmental stressors. Do you want to segue?
Sure.
Okay. That's all I've got. We're going to segue into a really great example.
Great. Thank you, Bob. I think I'm also going to go without the microphone, personalized. I know Bob and other speakers will be up here at the end, so you can ask more questions about the research you just heard. Bob mentioned crab and groundfish. I just wanted to put up this slide. We're starting to build our knowledge on species that we do know something about. I know this is probably small font for those of you in the back, but there's 14 species so far that have been studied in some way for their response to ocean acidification, and this list is slowly starting to build. At the same time, this is a list of species that have not been studied that live in Alaska waters. And a lot of the top commercial species so far, we don't know how they might respond, and so we have our work cut out for us. And I'm now excited to introduce a new project on ocean acidification and salmon, which is an example of filling this very important gap since Alaska is as we all know, very salmon focused. An interdisciplinary team formed last year to start looking at salmon in both the ecosystem context with the response to ocean acidification and also the socioeconomic impacts and potential ways we might be able to manage to sustain salmon stocks in a more acidified environment. And so I'd like to introduce Toby Schwer. He's with the Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of Alaska, and also Molly Mayo with the Meridian Institute, and she is involved in the stakeholder engagement portion of that research project.
Okay, thank you. Well, this project really came about thanks to Darcy, because she got a great network of researchers and stakeholders. And one of the issues she mentioned before, when she started introducing everybody, was that salmon was really a species of concern for a lot of the stakeholders, a lot of the Alaska communities. And that really prompted us to get together really a quite interdisciplinary, stellar team of researchers and beyond researchers, actually, which I'm going to get into, and looking at salmon, what could we learn about how best to adapt to the future oceans we're likely to face, and how can our salmon fisheries, how can we get our salmon fisheries there? So with generous support from the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program, we launched this project last year, and it's basically a group of researchers that includes people from University of Washington, Northwest Fisheries Science Center, Alaska Fisheries Science Center, and an advisory group that also comes from within these agencies that looks at are we guys making good, good academic research, also relevant to stakeholders, relevant to our fisheries and our communities. That was a real big goal of this. And we work closely, I should point out, with the Commercial Fisheries Division of ADF&G, with the managers, because eventually we want to inform their recruitment models, their managing models from this project. So existing salmon research on ocean acidification effects, it's really quite, there's only a few studies, predominantly these two studies, one on pink salmon, juvenile pink salmon, and the other one on coho adult salmon. Just recently, in the last 3 to 4 years, this published research came out. And what did they find? What did they find? Well, mainly they found what Bob already found with some of the effects on other organisms, effects on growth, effects on their reproduction system, navigation system, their ability to avoid predators or behave in the right way they're eventually conserving energy, and that has trade-offs for these organisms that's going to result in a reduced growth rates. But what we didn't see was any sockeye salmon studies, any of the more valuable salmon species. And what we also had some concerns is this study here was done under experimental conditions that are not quite to the current standard of doing OA laboratory experiments. So we really wanted to look at the species that's easily handleable in the laboratory, which was pink salmon compared to other species who are more difficult. And we wanted to replicate and hopefully improve on some of the current research, but also looking at some of those indirect effects, some of those food web effects, some of the more cumulative effects. So what we're going to be looking at, we're going to put juvenile pink salmon in the lab under OA, future OA ocean conditions, and we're going to have a feeding regime that's going to simulate some of the indirect effects. So effects of prey, salmon prey, that they're likely going to, that we think they will likely see in a future ocean, which should have more of an effect even on growth, hypothetically, than what we saw in previous studies. And so, what the overall research objectives are is to learn from those experiments and then integrate those into a bioeconomic analysis, just similar to what Bob showed on crab, and then inform our management responses to that. But also, I point out the engagement piece of this project was really quite large, engaging stakeholders like fishermen, like processors, salmon managers, and even communities, coastal communities, in a larger engagement process to come to the table, share not only results but take active part in this research. So by end of this year, we're starting that engagement process, which I'm going to show you later on in the timeline. Just to give you an example of some of the regime shifts in the Gulf of Alaska that have been occurring, and this is really ocean acidification is just one example of a tipping point or of an indicator for a potential tipping point towards a new regime, a new ecosystem, right? So some of you may still remember what happened in the 1970s, mid-1970s, when the Gulf of Alaska shifted from a predominantly predation, crab and krill and more, calcifying organism type predominantly ecosystem to a more groundfish dominated ecosystem. And this whole shift happened over like 15, 20 years, but it also showed that some of the populations increased, other populations decreased in fairly dramatic or more slower ways, so it varied across species. But what the point here is that this whole regime shift was driven by a climatic event, by the Aleutian low shifting southwards and intensifying and causing higher sea surface temperatures. So does that ring a bell? Temperatures rising and shifting from a more cold regime to a warmer regime. So these are all indicators of regime shift, and we're trying to find tools to statistically identify these tipping points when the ecosystem shifts into a new regime as kind of an early warning type tool to then be able to design a management response that's adaptive to that to then avoid a bad outcome, and more to that later. So what happened when this regime shift happened here, you can see here various different temperature trends between the 1950s and the 1990, early 2000s. You can see here in 1977, you all of a sudden see, warmer than normal temperatures. And down here in this graph, you can see the proportion of total catch. This is kind of the results of a test fishery, where you can see shrimp in red and some of the groundfish species in blue and green. You can see that change, that regime shift change, and the change in what you all of a sudden catch, right? Here are the species. It's a mixed picture again. You had some increases in some of these groundfish, like halibut and pollock and sole, but you also saw some dramatic decreases in Atka mackerel, for example, here like a collapse. Or your tanographs more, slowly, a slower rate decline. And then you had kind of mixed species where we're not quite sure, it's variable. The effects are not very clear. But these are just examples of an example of a regime shift. So what we want to find out is if we can detect early such a tipping point where the system goes into a new alternate system state, and using some statistical tools to do that. And then develop a management model to then look at, for example, in this case, we got two levers in the management of our stocks, and that's escapement goals and hatchery releases. Those are the two. What can we do to those two in order to avoid that bad outcome? That bad outcome being a multi-stability outcome where it could be over here, but it could quickly go from here over here. So it's not quite as certain as this stable outcome where you have ideally a harvestable species that's going to predominantly be in that new regime. So the key here is to find management opportunities that allow us to end up, allowing that adaptation to that harvestable species that Bob was talking about, and at the same time avoiding some really bad outcome for our communities, for our industry. And so we learned from history of these regime shifts in the Gulf, for example, that they can be very abrupt and they can be very irreversible. There's no way to go back to the old system. So they can have social and economic costs, clearly, because they're going to change what we're going to catch. And there's costs, really costs related to adaptation, to fishing gear switches, etc., to permits going not valuable anymore, to other permits becoming all the more valuable, which you don't have. And there's other questions, you know, how should we, as a salmon system in Alaska, respond to this? Are we just going to look at the responses of the current management system? How does that system, does the governance system need to adapt as well as the biological system? Those are the big questions. We want to hear from you how you feel about that. That's why collaboration comes into play. So your stakeholder input to us really partly drives the agenda of this research project, and I think that makes it all the more better for adaptation, because all of a sudden we're looking at this in a more holistic, we're going to look at it in a more holistic approach. How can we inform our salmon management, but at the same time, how are we best avoiding those bad outcomes? So that leads me to give you a little project timeline. We started in 2018, late 2018, with funding received from the Ocean Acidification Program. And we're hoping to do our lab study, which is probably something you really want to learn from also, just as much as we do. How are those juvenile pink salmon are going to grow under future ocean conditions? We're hoping to do that with Alaska pink salmon from Prince William Sound starting in April, just after they emerge. Hoping to finish up that lab study mid-July with results hopefully by the fall of next year. And then we're going to integrate those results into bioeconomic models and look at how our tipping point analysis can inform the model and inform optimal management response. And then also in 2020, next year, we're going to start to more formally engage stakeholders. And Molly is going to talk about stakeholder engagement.
Thanks, Toby. So good news, this is my only slide. It's pretty much the last one. Darcy will wrap up with just a couple more notes on the broader network of ocean acidification after I'm finished here. But this is really just to emphasize a couple of really key points that makes this evening really important, and I think part of the reason we want to engage a broader community. As Bob was explaining, I think the science that we have so far is helping us to better understand the potential, maybe even hope for adaptation. And as Toby was explaining, this latest study, one of the things that makes it especially exciting is that we're looking at species that are a species that's particularly important to Alaska in Alaskan conditions, so it'll help us to really understand this species, this system that we really care about as Alaskans. And the final point that Toby started making as he was explaining this overall study is that it goes beyond the science. It's not a standard study that ends up on a shelf and that we all read, and it's got lots of notes at the end notes and references alone. It's that. And it also takes the next step of saying, what are some of the alternatives? What does this tell us? How do we take that next step to think about how do we adapt? What are the options? So we're very excited. We're not entirely sure how the science is going to start playing out and how we want to, shape the questions that we're asking. But we know that we want to take it beyond the study and start thinking about what are some of the options for adaptation. What does this mean for adaptation? How do we help to think about that next step of helping to create that opportunity for adaptation in the future? And one of the ways that we're doing that is engaging stakeholders like you that are interested in and active and watching these species in real life in the systems, your fishermen and your interested parties that can help to inform some of our assumptions and some of the ideas and alternatives that we're considering, and think about the pros and cons and gaps and opportunities that are out there. So that is what I think is really exciting about this particular opportunity. And we're kicking off something that hopefully will take it to the next level. It's part of the reason that we wanted to meet with the Board of Fish today, to make them aware of the study and how it can help to inform better decisions in the future, and how we can continue to keep them involved so that their decisions are informed by what comes out of the study. And then finally, that it's not just a small group of stakeholders that are getting together. It's not just scientists. We want to be reaching out to other people, but we also want to get the information out to a broader community. And that is a nice segue into Darcy coming back up and saying a few more words about this broader network. The Ocean Acidification Network helps us to reach out to others that are interested more broadly and reach beyond a stakeholder group and stakeholder activities just with this study, and gives us a broader reach to help communicate the outcomes to other people who care about it. So we're really excited about it. This is the beginning, as Toby gave you a little snapshot of the timeline. We're expecting this to start gearing up as the lab studies are started, so we can engage people even in shaping some of those, the assumptions that we make in the modeling, et cetera, and get more information, make better decisions. Thank you.
Thanks, Molly. This is an excellent example of a move forward where we often hear, okay, we know this is going on. What do we actually do? And hopefully this project is going to help us work towards answering or being part of that what we need to be part of. Before we move in, we're just about to move into our Q&A session. I just wanted to point you back to the Alaska, we call it the OA network. There's a lot of great efforts going on around the state. The network is attempting to kind of be the glue that holds those efforts together, helping researchers work together, aggregating information. There's about 35 organizational partners right now that are part of the network, and these range from research institutions to hatcheries to tribes. It's free to join. We welcome new members. Some of these partners are actively partnering on projects. Other ones just say, hey, we can use our listserv to get your information out. Please sign us up. I also just wanted to briefly go over a few informational resources that are on that website. There's like nuts and bolts about ocean acidification if you want to share what you learned tonight with your friends. There's an expertise database. That's what's shown here. It shows the different people around Alaska that are working on ocean acidification, what their specialty is, their geographic area, and the way to contact them if you have a specific question that you would like to go directly to a scientist with. There's links to databases, announcements about upcoming presentations. Every month we try to highlight a scientist, kind of like a human interest piece. Who's the scientist are interesting? And recent news. The network also has 6 topic-specific working groups ranging from fishing community engagement to K-12 education. So we're reaching out to teachers and saying, hey, how can we help you educate kids about this? What are your barriers right now? What do you need? We've started a good dialogue with that. There's also a tribal water sampling group. There's over 20 communities right now in Alaska that are sampling once a week for ocean acidification and sending it to a lab to have it tested. So we're starting to build up baseline data for communities all around the state. And also, we've also been trying to reach Alaska coastal communities with dialogues like this. You can see a list of communities so far that have had ocean acidification talks and conversations. And then I know it's way too small there in the back, but other presentations for trying to keep this dialogue going. And then we like to end with what you can do. So up here are a few ideas on ways to stay educated. A sheet went around to join the network listserv. About once a month an email comes out with latest news, the latest that we've learned about what's going on in our waters. There's reading material up here. This is the ocean acidification state of the science brochure. It's written for the level of a non-scientist, and it was actually requested from the fishing industry. So we'd like to have something that we could take on the boat and just flip through and learn about what do we know so far about crab, what do we know about cod, what do we know about the Gulf of Alaska, and that's going to be updated in about another month with a little insert for what we know now about 2019. So a few other materials here. And then ways to be active include joining a working group, working with Molly and the rest of us on the salmon project, circulating communication or information among your colleagues. And then, of course, we get to the bottom, supporting green energy policies and reducing carbon consumption, because as Bob showed us at the beginning, that is the root cause of the problem that we're trying to address. So I think with that, we're going to bring Bob and Toby and Molly up here, and we would love to open it up to some dialogue and Q&A.
Yeah, probably a question for you, Bob. it looked like we had 400, the measurement was like 400 parts per million in Mauna Loa.
Yep.
When was the last time in geologic history when that level of CO2 was
Ever recorded? Never.
what's that?
Never, it's not in our records. So we go back in those ice cores and we've never seen it that high.
That was 800,000, what you said.
Yeah, over the course of that, and obviously there's a caveat, we're estimating what happened 800,000 years ago. But our best estimates of those data and those ice cores suggest that it's never been this high. In what we can measure, but you also have to remember that some of the events we're talking about where you would have something greater like an asteroid impact on the planet, you're not seeing that in an ice core. It's not a measurable event. Probably wasn't any ice.
Okay, and I guess, so we really don't know what the effect of that might be, and I guess in the end, maybe we should just catch all the fish now, and because they're going to be gone soon anyway.
So figure a fisherman would say that.
So we get that comment a lot.
We're looking at that.
Take them now while you can, and that's I mean,
We're
Yeah,
already
that's-
going
that's
down
it.
that path, and as a tribal member, I'm gonna say no. But our elders have been telling us that the fish have been getting smaller for quite some time. ADF&G has been doing age, sex, and length of fish coming back and taking OPA samples, and they've got over 20 years worth of those samples, and they've been taking the age, sex, and length of the Chinook as well, and taking scale samples, and they know that they're getting smaller. I'm just wondering if you can take that data and correlate it with what you know with the acidity, and see if you can find some correlation.
It's unlikely that right now those are related, because the acidification has not gotten to the point where we've taken out the prey resource for Chinook. So it's
Well, it's happening with sockeye as well.
Right.
And they are smaller, so it just, just trying to see if, there's something there that you can look at what you folks have and look at what the state has and come up and see if there's any correlation at all.
That's a great idea, pull those data sets together.
So, carbon dioxide, is that what it's called?
Carbon dioxide, sure.
And the crabs now, and it's on the bottom of the ocean already, so the crab are down there, so apparently we've probably eaten it already, huh?
So it does not harm humans.
Oh, thank you.
So the seafood is good to go,
Okay.
no problems. Just carbon dioxide, we breathe it out.
Right. That's good news.
Yes.
So behind Duncan, there's a question, and then there's Duncan, Ronnie, because you had your hand up first. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I had a question, but I also had a comment that I'd like to make. And that comment is that I'm really appreciative of you folks bringing this stuff forward and talking about being able to be aware that you're going to have to adjust management as these environmental changes come about, because we're seeing environmental changes, invasive species, and whether that's associated with global warming or whatever, but making folks aware that management schemes may have to change because of these adaptations or these new conditions that are in front of us. I think it's a good message to be sending out, particularly to folks like the Board of Fisheries and the Department of Fish and Game. So I really appreciate that. My question, however, is we're looking at, we mentioned salmon species here, and a lot of salmon species have a freshwater portion of their life cycle. I'm assuming that most of the carbon dioxide that's going into the ocean is going into the ocean. Most of it's going there because the ocean is so big. But there are freshwater systems that must be taking up some of this carbon dioxide and changing the pH in there. So there's another stage of the life cycle of these organisms that we need to be concerned about. At least I think that's true. Have you seen any results of, or any information on changes in freshwater systems or potential changes in freshwater systems back in the 70s and 80s, there was acid rain, acid precipitation stuff, and there's a lot of these poorly buffered lakes and stuff that are out here. So is there a threat there that we also have to be worried about?
So I'll address both things you said. The effects in freshwater are less than that of seawater because of the chemical makeup. And because the other variables that change pH in freshwater outweigh the changes that we're seeing in because of carbon dioxide being drawn down into freshwater. So we do have our Great Lakes region is part of this overall national assessment of acidification, and they're doing that research right now. So while there is an effect, the effect is not as large compared to all the other pH issues going on. So I would expect that in Alaskan waters, that is not as much of an issue. They're already in a high alkaline situation, especially if they're in a glacier-fed system. It's already so high that it's not changing in a way that you're going to see any differences. And you know, to your first comment, I appreciate your comment, and I think it's important that as we're talking about the potential to manage, that it's because of the potential for adaptation. It's the potential for, you know, if we didn't think any of these animals had any adaptive potential, take them. But we believe what we're seeing is enough adaptation that if we're smart about it, the populations on the backside are strong and healthy. Not all species are going to survive this. You know, a lot of jellyfish are going to survive everything. They're everywhere. But not all species will survive. But it's a balance. It's a balance.
I think there's a question back there first.
Oh, two questions. What is it about black-cod sablefish physiologically or life cycle that's made them a winner?
So, not acidification. So we're talking temperature. Although we're also talking acidification because they have an extremely deep life history. So they are in corrosive waters as well. So let's talk acidification quickly first. Genetically, they're adapted. You know, it's like golden key crab. It's like you know, any of the species you can think of that are below 300 meters in the Gulf of Alaska are in corrosive water. So the answer there is not that they're doing better because of it. It's just that they've adapted to it. That's the great hope, is that this happens. Now, they adapted through evolution. They adapted over a long period of time. My concern is, will other species be able to adapt with the extreme increase that we're seeing? So that's that argument. You know, the black-cod situation right now with these heat waves is they're doing phenomenal. We're seeing a massive amount of increased recruitment. They've got a life history where they're at depth as eggs and larvae. They come up in the water column, they migrate, and what it suggests is that the bottleneck in their life history prior to now has been somewhere in that juvenile stage. And now that those waters are warmer, they're growing faster and they're finding their food. So, you know, it's a good example. Any of the species that we're talking about, they all have bottlenecks in their life history. You know, where's the salmon mortality bottleneck? Is it in the river? Is it in the ocean? Is it in the estuaries? And if this change in temperature is affecting that bottleneck region, then you're a winner or a loser. You know, that's the point. So what we're thinking with sablefish is that it's just that juvenile stage. They're just growing, and that they're getting past maybe a predator pit. They're growing past where predators were previously taking them out of the system. We don't know. It's an example. But yeah, they're doing well. It's good to hear a positive story about something doing well.
I have a question for Bob. You work for the federal government. Do you have a list of words and phrases you weren't allowed to use in this talk?
Absolutely. Turn the camera off. I'm kidding. Just turn it off. No. No.
I have a real comment then.
Yeah.
I appreciate you studying this, and I'm really encouraged by the fact you're looking at salmon. My biggest concern about salmon is I believe that they're very resilient, and I guess I would hypothesize you're going to find that they may be adaptable. But if the biggest effect of ocean acidification is in the prey, in the secondary productivity phase, then it doesn't matter, or it matters a lot less, because that's what's going to kill them.
Couldn't agree with you more. I think there's two things there. One, you may have shifted the bottleneck I was just talking about.
Yes.
You know, it could be that the bottleneck now is at an early life stage in the estuary, and it could be that that bottleneck shifts to prey
H2,
resources
yeah.
later in the life history. Could be. You know, a lot of the initial ocean acidification work that highlighted the impacts of pink salmon because of pteropods is probably overblown. Pink salmon switch prey. They don't depend solely on pteropods. And I think that's going to be the key as to whether or not, again, if it happens too fast, you'll lose your classes because they're not prepared. If it happens slow enough, they'll have switched prey. So that's, the whole thing is about time.
Toby, could you talk maybe a little more about how that prey fits into your salmon project or the model? Is that part of the salmon?
There's a consideration of prey, definitely the prey be part of it, and it's one of the reasons why we want to have that in the lab study as a component, so we can then integrate that into the model. But right now, we're not at the point where prey is part of the model, but we'll make it there.
So is this presentation available on the website?
Thanks to Scott Gruen, he's recording this evening, and it will be on the OA Network website and also on the Facebook page. So thank you, Scott.
So I represent 2,500 fishermen in Southeast Alaska, and so I will carry this message and information to the board, which will get out to the members.
Thank you. Any question here?
Yes, in addition to salmon, I also fish for spot prawns, which are a deep water organism. And from the discussion, those should be doing okay because they already live around glaciers a lot of times in very deep water.
So we haven't done any research on the prawns. Their shell makeup is slightly different from the crab that I was mentioning. They have more of a different kind of calcium that is more susceptible to acidification. But because they live at depth, they're probably already in corrosive water. The problem is those prawns vertically migrate for food. They come up in the water column for food. So the question is, if a larger portion of their life is in corrosive water as the whole water column becomes corrosive, will that become a problem for the shrimp? And that's what we don't know. We don't know the answer. But you're right in thinking that they're probably more resilient, more adaptable, because they already live in that highly variable environment. When studies have been done on Dungeness crab versus king crab, we found that the Dungeness were not as susceptible as the king crab, probably because they live near the freshwater, interface with the ocean. They're getting a lot more of that alkaline water that's more acidic. So I would carry that to prawns. It would probably be the same thing.
Question back there.
So a lot of the communities and the fisheries, they focus on the shelf. And obviously a few hundred feet is a lot different than several 10 to 20,000 feet. And a lot of the research transects that I saw up there are also on the shelf. How are you able to measure or monitor the whole water column off the shelf? I know that there's not as many commercial fisheries out there, but would you say that 90% of the research about the ocean acidification is up on the shelf in the upper water column, or how does it kind of compare off the shelf to on the shelf?
Yeah, so all the research is on the shelf because 99% of the production is on the shelf. There's not a lot once you go off the shelf. But let me use this as an opportunity to explain a natural process. So the world's oceans move, right? In general, there's a great big conveyor belt out there that starts in the North Atlantic with cold water. That cold water sinks and then travels the world's oceans and it comes up right out in our backyard in the North Pacific. So the whole time it's doing that, it's collecting carbon dioxide from all the animals that respire CO2. So when that comes up in the North Pacific, it has lots of natural CO2 in it. So we don't go deep, we don't go off the shelf, because it is already corrosive. Part of that's why you don't see a lot of these same shell-building animals out there. So the concern is what's happening on the shelf, not what's out deep.
But that's that same concept, the conveyor belt, that happens in the Bering Sea as well, so I'm sure that plays into this acidification of the flush of the floor.
Yep, absolutely. Yep, whenever you bring those deep waters up, it's a problem for the animals.
So Toby, you showed like different tipping points. At the tipping point back in the 70s, I think you said, when it went from like shellfish to more fish, what were the management practices that happened then that, I don't know, helped make that change? And if you can like predict what species will be affected by this, what management practices will be implemented, I guess? Like, do you manage population levels, like how much you can fish? Is that what happens in these cases?
I can't speak to the 70s, but I presume that they didn't detect the tipping point coming up and didn't quite respond to their management. Probably somehow, all of a sudden they had a different mix of harvestable species, some totally collapsed. Actually, I would need to do more research on what exactly happened in terms of the communities and what it meant for the economies and all of that.
The last king crab season in Kodiak was
And
1982.
you
In
probably-
1980, there
yeah.
were 50 million pounds of king crab taken. By 1982, the fish was over. That's how they responded.
Not enough time
There
to
we go.
react. I would also say that, that management practices were not as sophisticated as they are now. You know, I think we have better tools available to us to know what's coming. I think we have better tools to be able to model and manage the data that we have available to us, so I think we have a better shot at being able to deal with this now than we did before. Things have changed quite a bit since that crash.
So we'll just be looking at our model right now. We'll be looking at two things. What can we do on escapement goals? And what can we do on hatchery releases? And there's trade-offs related to both. So we'll account for those trade-offs in that model to figure out what's the optimal strategy to reduce the risk long term.
Any other questions? One more right there.
Yeah, I was just curious, how much do aquatic macrophytes affect the carbon dioxide in the water and the acidification? The reason why I'm asking that is because there's been some effort to talk about harvesting more from the oceans and actually growing algae and stuff like that.
I can jump to that. So the question was, how does macroalgae affect ocean acidification, affect the carbon dioxide in the water? And part of that's because there's been a real interest in harvesting more.
Growing and harvesting.
And growing, absolutely. So on a local scale, a macroalgae forest, for instance, can have a massive impact on the amount of carbon dioxide drawdown. So that's why a lot of the mariculture farms are now, raising, oysters and macroalgae in separate lines, because the algae is clean in the water and providing a better environment for the bivalve grow-out. So on a local scale, incredibly effective. And there's a lot of research going in that direction. There are some think tanks internationally that have suggested we could seed macroalgae on a massive scale offshore and somehow balance the planet's carbon dioxide budget. I'm skeptical.
I wouldn't care to go that direction. Thank you.
Yeah, they're incredible at the carbon dioxide drawdown.
Okay, well, I think we're closing in on 7 o'clock. We know you probably would all like to eat dinner, but we really want to thank you for coming and asking such great questions too. And we hope you'll take home some material, and we hope to work with you in the coming weeks, months, and years as we continue to address this issue. So thanks again.